A 90-year-old racist woman tells Big Shaq, "Go back to Africa." His response stuns the crowd. One sunny afternoon, Big Shaq, known for his towering presence and fame as a basketball legend, decided to visit his usual corner store. Despite his celebrity status and impressive physique, standing over 2 meters tall, he enjoyed the simple pleasure of grocery shopping. It was his way of unwinding after long, demanding days. Casually dressed in a gray t-shirt, jeans, and a shiny watch, Shaq strolled into the bustling store with his usual friendly demeanor. The staff, familiar with his visits, greeted him warmly, and he returned their smiles as he picked up a basket and began walking through the aisles. Stopping at the cereal section, Shaq browsed the shelves with focused attention, carefully reading labels to find something nutritious. He was so absorbed in his task that he didn't notice an elderly woman, Mrs. Margaret, approaching behind him. She was a petite lady with snow-white hair, leaning on a cane and pushing a squeaky cart. "Excuse me, young man," her voice rang out sharply. "How am I supposed to get my cereal when you're standing in the way?" Startled, Shaq turned around to face her. Seeing her stern expression, he quickly stepped aside with a polite smile. "Sorry about that, ma'am," he said warmly. But Mrs. Margaret wasn't finished. Glancing up at him with a disapproving look, she muttered, "They'll let anyone in here these days. No standards anymore." Her words carried a tone of prejudice that Shaq couldn't ignore. Though her remark stung, he chose to remain calm, a principle he'd held onto throughout his life. With a deep breath, he resumed browsing, determined not to let her words ruin his day. As Shaq moved to leave the aisle, Mrs. Margaret suddenly shouted, her voice loud and accusatory, "Security! Someone get security here now!" The store fell silent as customers turned to see what was happening. A young security guard hurried over, looking bewildered. Mrs. Margaret pointed at Shaq with a trembling finger. "Get him out of here! People like him don't belong here. Send him back to Africa." Time seemed to stand still. Shaq stood motionless, processing the hateful words. Though his expression remained composed, the hurt was evident in his eyes. He had faced prejudice before, but the blatant venom in her words was a painful reminder of the challenges he still endured. The security guard hesitated, glancing between Mrs. Margaret and Shaq. "Ma'am," he said carefully, "he hasn't done anything wrong. He's just shopping." Mrs. Margaret's face flushed with anger. "Are you refusing to listen to me?" she demanded, banging her cane on the floor. "Get the manager." Moments later, the store manager arrived, looking serious. Mrs. Margaret wasted no time, pointing again at Shaq. "I want him out of this store. No." Before the manager could respond, Shaq stepped forward. His deep, steady voice filled the aisle. "Ma'am," he began, his tone calm but firm, "I understand that you may not be used to seeing someone like me here. But I'm just here to shop, like you and everyone else. I'm a son, a friend, a hard-working man, and a citizen of this community. My skin color doesn't change that." The store remained silent as Shaq continued, his words powerful yet full of grace. "I've faced comments like yours before. They're hurtful, but I choose not to respond with anger. Instead, I feel sad. Sad that someone who has lived as long as you have could hold onto such outdated views." Mrs. Margaret faltered, her eyes dropping to the floor. Shaq's voice softened. "I have a grandmother about your age. She taught me to respect my elders because they've seen and experienced things I never will. But if she were here and heard the words you said to me, I think she'd feel disappointed." The room was heavy with emotion. A few shoppers wiped their eyes, moved by Shaq's composure and sincerity. "You've seen the world change," Shaq said gently. "If your grandchildren heard what happened here today, would they be proud? Is this the legacy you want to leave behind?" Mrs. Margaret's hands trembled as tears welled in her eyes. Her voice quivered as she finally spoke. I didn't think of it that way. You're right. I'm sorry. Shaq gave her a kind smile. It's okay, ma'am. We all make mistakes. What's important is learning from them. The aisle erupted in applause. Mrs. Margaret reached out, placing a hand on Shaq's arm. Her voice was now soft and genuine. Thank you for teaching me this, she said. Shaq nodded. We can all learn from one another. That's how we grow. The tension in the store dissolved. The manager thanked Shaq for his grace, and customers approached to express their admiration. Even Mrs. Margaret, now visibly humbled, left with a warm smile. As Shaq exited the store that evening, the golden sunset bathed the street in a peaceful glow. He felt a sense of fulfillment, knowing he had transformed a moment of hostility into one of understanding and humanity. The story spread through the community, becoming a powerful reminder of compassion and forgiveness. Mrs. Margaret, once known for her biases, began greeting everyone with kindness, while Shaq continued to inspire others with his big heart and unshakable belief in the power of kindness.